Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Paula Croxon, and I'm the Director of Public Programs for the Zuckerman Institute. And I would like to welcome everyone to this evening's Stavros Niarchos Foundation Brain Insight Lecture. Firstly, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time out of your lives. Thank you for joining us virtually as we continue to share our commitment to outstanding science and excellent programming. And we really hope that tonight's presentation will not only leave you with a better understanding of the science happening at the Zuckerman Institute, but also to share real life examples of how science shows up in our everyday lives. And to help you think about exciting topics like tonight's, which explores the intersection of neuroscience and art, in very much the same way that my cat is exploring this plant here. Before we start, I really want to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and the many foundation members who join us here tonight for your continued partnership and commitment to helping us make brain science accessible to the public. And I think you can all agree with me here that this has never been as important as it is now. Tonight, you will be treated to two presentations by two incredible speakers, followed by a conversation led by Columbia University's Katy Gero. Katy is a computer science PhD candidate at Columbia University in the computational design lab, where she studies how computers can support complex writing tasks. Rather than working to automate the writing process, so don't panic, writers, she's not seeking to replace you just yet. Katy is seeking to understand how computers can complement human writers. And in her most recent project, she developed science writing support tool and is studying how climate scientists make use of this tool when writing about their work for the general public. So I hope you can all agree that Katy is the perfect person to moderate a talk about science and society. But beyond her thesis, she hopes to study where the outputs of language technologies are considered offensive and how we might appropriately use these technologies in sensitive contexts. Katy is also a poet and an essayist and has published in Catapult, Taper, and more. She's currently working on a poetry manuscript titled Whalefall. And now I hope you can all see why Katy is the perfect person to moderate a talk and discussion about the confluence of art and the brain. Just before I turn it over to Katy, I just want to thank those of you who've already submitted a question. And I think what makes these gatherings, whether they're in person or virtual, so dynamic and exciting is when we're able to actually answer some of your questions. So to mimic that in the virtual space, I'd like to encourage you to locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and submit any questions that come up for you as you listen to tonight's talk. We particularly welcome questions from the teachers and high school students in our audience. So if that's you, let us know that you fall into one of those categories so we can feature your question. And please join me in giving a very warm virtual welcome to our host and moderator, Katy Gero.
Thanks, Paula, for that really kind introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce this virtual event. Today, we're going to explore how the brain processes what we see and ways that we can create computer models to better understand our vision. But we're also going to hear about the process of making art and the responses that it can generate in its audiences. So we hope that these two talks will give us a window into some connections and parallels between art and science. As Paula mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Computer Science, and I'm also a writer and a poet. And in my work, I'm seeking to understand how people can collaborate with AI in creative tasks. And my focus is on writing because that's kind of where I'm most familiar. So I've worked on metaphor generation and science writing. But I think at the core of what I'm interested in is a question about how advances in computational technology are going to end up being incorporated into some of our most challenging and creative and maybe human endeavors. So I'm really excited to moderate this event and learn, along with all of you, about neuroscience and vision and art making, and how all of these can kind of come together and influence how we see the world. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Nikolaus Kriegeskorte and Amanda Phingbodhipakkiya, two experts who work in very different fields. On one hand, the way the brain processes visual information, and on the other, multidisciplinary art. But despite these apparent differences, I think we're going to see that there's a lot of parallels between the processes of art and science. And we also want to uncover some ways in which our understanding of each of these things can inform each other. So for tonight, we're going to hear two 15-minute talks, one from each speaker, after which I'm going to moderate a discussion in which we'll include questions from the audience. So if you've already submitted a question, that's great. We really thank you for doing so. And while the talks are in progress, if you want to submit a question based on what you hear or what it's making you think about, as Paula said, please look for the Q&A button to submit your questions and they'll come through and we'll be able to hopefully answer a lot of them at the end. And again, as Paula mentioned, please let us know if you're a teacher or a student. And if you're a student, if you want to tell us what grade you're in, that would be awesome. All right, so it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Nikolaus Kriegeskorte, who is a computational neuroscience who studies how our brains enable us to see and understand the world around us. Nico is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Columbia University and an affiliated member of the Department of Electrical Engineering. He is a principal investigator and director of cognitive imaging at the Mortimer B. Zuckerman Mind Behavior Brain Institute at Columbia University, and he received his PhD in cognitive neuroscience from Maastricht University. He's held postdoctoral positions at the University of Minnesota and the US National Institute of Mental Health in Bethesda, and was a program leader at the UK Medical Research Council Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge, UK. So I think we're all going to be really excited to hear from him. Kriegeskorte is a co-founder of the conference Cognitive Computational Neuroscience. And so please join me in welcoming Nico to our virtual stage tonight.
Thanks so much, Katie and Paula. It's great to be here. Okay, so let me share my screen. I hope this is working.
Yes.
So I want to talk a little bit about the form and content of the mind. And this is sort of trying out some thoughts that are very big picture and that are about connecting disciplines in ways that haven't quite happened yet. And I want to draw some parallels to art. I'm not going to talk about the neuroscience of art perception, but I'm going to use form and content as kind of a vehicle to draw some parallels that I find interesting. So when I think of form and content, the distinction between form and content, the first thing I think of is seven segment displays like these. So they can be LED or LCD displays. We're all familiar with them. And this is an example of a visual display where the distinction between form and content is crystal clear. So when you see these for the first time and you know what digits look like, you're in a position to generalize and to predict what the other 7-segment digits will look like. So when I show them to you, of course, you're already familiar with these, but even if you saw them for the first time, you could separate completely cleanly form and content in this case and predict what the other digits would look like. So this is an extreme case where form and content can be perfectly separated. And the form, it's this substrate of presentation. It's the shape of these little segments here that I use to communicate the content, which is the digit. Let's consider a slightly different example. Here's a font. Here's a font that I like particularly. It's a simplified font. If I show you these first 3 letters, you're probably able to abstract what the form is and then predict from your knowledge of the content what the next letter will look like, the D. Maybe you can imagine that. So here's the D, and I'm pretty sure you're not very surprised about this. And we can go on through the alphabet. Here's the E. We can think about the F, the F should be really easy. I'm sure you're not surprised at all. But now let's think about the G. What do you think the G will be? So I'll show you the G, and I can tell you when I saw it, I was surprised. And I think this one is brilliant. This is wonderful. This is a really good and interesting font. So this gives us an idea of the distinction between form and content. For me, when as a kid, I thought about that distinction for the first time. I understood it for the first time. That was a great intellectual moment. I realized, so I can look at anything in the world from these two perspectives, and then I'll have very different thoughts about the same thing. I can just switch my mental perspective on whatever image or whatever scene I'm looking at, and come to a very different understanding of it. When form and content are extricable, like in these two examples, for me, that's the definition of not art. So for me, art means that form and content are inextricable in some sense. So we could say that the 7-segment display here is firmly on the side of not art, and this font, this beautiful font, is a little bit further along this continuum and is clearly artistic in important ways. So form and content also relate to the study of the mind, which is my field. And curiously, we have two different disciplines that study the form and the content of the mind respectively. And these are neuroscience and cognitive science. So neuroscience focuses on the form, on the biological substrate of the mind. Here's an image from the Ziegelbaum lab at the Zuckerman Institute. It's a beautiful image of the forest of neurons in the hippocampus. This is the mouse hippocampus, the CA2 region. And the Ziegelbaum lab really cares about these biological cells and about their spatial structure and about their biology and metabolism and dynamics and ion channels. But at the same time, they study a very high-level cognitive process here, social interaction. They have to use a mouse model, and they have to make a lot of simplifications to the process and experiments in order to be able to do that and still take the biology very seriously, but they managed to do that somehow. At the other end of the spectrum is work in cognitive science. Here's an example from the lab of Joshua Tenenbaum. And in their papers, you'll see very different kinds of images. So here's one example. You see a photo of a scene as someone might encounter in life. And then you see an abstracted representation of what might be the contents of the mind. So cognitive science is all about the contents of the mind and tries to build computer models of the information processing of those contents in the mind. So this division between form and content is curious to me because form and content, of course, interact, right? And it seems questionable whether the right approach to understanding the mind is to cleanly separate these two. So in computational neuroscience, we often think of neural activity patterns as representations of mental content. So for example, we study vision, so we present visual images, and these visual images elicit neural activity patterns, and we think of these patterns as the brain's representations of the content that is in the images. So this implies a kind of encoder-decoder model where we think of the part of the brain that processes the sensory inputs as the encoder, and then we think of the rest of the brain that uses the activity pattern in our region of interest in order to improve the behavioral responses of the animal in a way that helps the animal behave more successfully as the decoder. So I want to explore this analogy between art and the brain in terms of form and content in the following way. So we can think of a work of art similarly as a kind of interface between the artist and the recipient. So the encoder would be the artist's expression, and the decoder would be the recipient's impression. And the work of art connects the artist to the recipient. So when we study neural activity patterns, we usually think of these patterns, which can be patterns across large numbers of neurons, maybe thousands of neurons or millions of neurons. We think of the patterns as points in a multivariate response space, and we're interested in the geometry of these points. We think of the geometry as a good characterization of aspects of the format in which the content of these mental representations is expressed. So each visual stimulus elicits a particular neural response pattern, and the pattern can be thought of as a point in a high-dimensional space where there's one dimension for each of the neurons. I'm showing this here just for 3 dimensions because it's difficult to draw for thousands of dimensions, but really it's a very high-dimensional space. But we can still use the same concepts of points in the space and distances between points to understand these representations and the code, the format in which the information is encoded. So it's the geometry of these points that we call the representational geometry. So here's an example of a bunch of images of objects, natural objects, little cutout photos. And we presented these objects to humans one at a time. So they see one of these objects at a time while measuring their brain activity pattern. And the arrangement that you see here is an arrangement that places 2 objects close together if they elicit similar neural activity patterns in higher level visual cortex, and far apart if they elicited dissimilar neural activity patterns. And we think of dissimilar neural activity patterns as indicating that the brain region in question cares about the difference between these 2 pieces of mental content, these 2 images. So different brain areas will have different things that they care about, different aspects of the information that they emphasize, and the dimensions that they emphasize will correspond to large distances in these multivariate response patterns. So here's a smaller version of the same arrangement where I've color-coded different categories, and you see that all the faces clustered together in the lower left there, and on the left side here, it's all pictures of animate things, so animals and body parts and people. And on the right side, it's all inanimate objects, including natural and artificial objects. So this is a way of going from the content to the form. So we start with the content, we choose some stimuli, we present them, we measure the brain activity, and then we try to characterize the format in which the brain represents these stimuli. We also try to go in the opposite direction, starting with the form, starting with the substrate, with the biological brain, and then trying to build the bridge to the content. So here's a beautiful drawing by Cajal of a single pyramidal neuron. And this has been very inspiring. Studying the morphology of these cells has been incredibly inspiring to neuroscientists who have always been interested in what these cells are doing, of course. And a central intuition is that these neurons have many inputs. They have a complex dendrite, a tree of extensions where the neuron picks up signals from many other neurons. And then they have a single output, the axon, where they can output an action potential or not output anything. So this has been incredibly inspiring to neuroscientists and also to engineers and to cognitive scientists, because it suggests that the basic building block of the brain, the neuron, is a little machine for abstraction that takes a complex pattern and then renders a simple binary decision, reducing the complexity and categorizing the patterns of inputs. And whether this is really correct or whether this is a whole story or not is a deep question, but it is a very old idea that's still very much at the center of neuroscience and also cognitive science. So just as the people in Siegelbaum's lab have to abstract from a lot of the complexities of social cognition when they study it in mice. Cognitive scientists who want to model the information processing for cognitive processes in the human brain have to abstract from a lot of details of the biology. So the simplified model that is currently particularly important is an extreme abstraction that leaves out almost all the complexity of biological neurons and pretends that what a single neuron does is just taking a pattern of input signals and then passing them through a static nonlinearity to produce a rate of outputs. So we can relate that to the cognitive process of visual recognition by imagining that this weight pattern fits some pattern of pixels that we want to recognize. For example, here the letter C, and the weight pattern with which these signals coming from the image pixels are weighted matches the input pattern, then the neuron will produce an output. And these kinds of units can be connected in complex networks. So here's a network with two hidden layers and an output layer. And this is just a little a toy network. So in reality, these networks have large numbers of neurons. So there's an input that's an image. You only see two input units here. There would be an input unit for each of the pixels of the image. And then there is an output unit for each of the categories that we might, for example, want to recognize in these images. We can then pass an image into this network. And let's say this network just has two output units. And in the beginning, the connection weights are randomly initialized. And so because the weights are randomly initialized, the network might, in the beginning, call this input picture of a dog here a cat. So that would be incorrect. And then what we do to set those weights is for each of the training images, we adjust each connection strength slightly to reduce the output error. And we can repeat that for lots of images in a very big network, and then set all these parameters, the connection weights, and achieve amazing performance at simple recognition tasks. So in real deep nets, there will be millions of units and hundreds of millions of connections, and they might be supervised with millions of category labeled images. In our lab, when we built these kinds of networks and use many different architectures, including, importantly, recurrent architectures where the signals can go around in cycles, and the system can use its limited resources over time to perform deeper computations. When we build these models and compare these models, we often need to make clever stimuli in order to find out which of these models is a better model of the human perceptual process. So one approach to this that I want to share with you was developed by Golan in my lab, a brilliant postdoc. So what I'm going to show you here is a comparison between 4 different deep neural network models that you see along the vertical and along the horizontal here. We're going to compare each of these models to each other model. And in order to compare them efficiently, we generate images that one of these models classifies very confidently as a Persian cat, while the other model will classify the same image very confidently as a Weimaraner dog. So when we do that for these first 2 models here, the inception model and the ResNet model, we get these images that don't really look like anything to humans. And yet, for each of them, one of the 2 networks thinks with very high confidence that it's a Persian cat, and the other one thinks it's a Weimaraner dog. So from this, we can see that both of these models are very different from human perception, and we can reject both of these models confidently. And that allows us to make progress. Science progresses by rejecting hypotheses, and that's what this approach here allows us to do. But when we bring in these adversarially trained models here, then we get images that when the image is optimized to look like a Weimaraner dog to the adversarially trained models, but like a Persian cat to the first two models, Inception or ResNet 50, then these images tend to actually look like Weimaraner dogs. So that gives us some evidence that these adversarially trained models here are better models of human perception. We can play the game the other way around and optimize the images to look like Persian cats to the adversarially trained models. And then they actually look a little bit more like cats than like dogs. Of course, we need to do formal psychophysics with subjects. We have to ask subjects into the lab to judge these images so we can statistically compare and statistically reject different models. But I'm just showing you some of the stimuli here. When we pit these two different adversarially trained models against each other, however, we get these strange looking creatures that don't really clearly fall into either of the two categories. So that shows us that even these two relatively better models fall short of really capturing how humans represent these images. So here's an image of a scene in Tübingen. And this looks like a painting. It looks like a work of art at first sight. But according to the definition I presented in the beginning, this is actually not a work of art. This is an artificial image that was produced using these neural network models. It was based on this photograph of a scene in Tübingen as the content image, combined with this style image, which is a painting by Turner. And the process took visual statistics of the style image and imposed them onto this content image to produce this, this kind of artificial painting, right? So this looks a little bit like a painting, maybe for a short time. If you look at it a little longer, you'll notice that it's, you know, impressive in some ways, but it's not really a great piece of art. And I would argue here that the clear separation of form and content suggests that it's not art at all. So I hope I've convinced you that there are cases where form and content interact in particularly simple ways, like when we pixelate an image. But in art, form and content are inextricable. They interact in ways that are much more complicated and make it much harder to separate the two out. Imagine in the humanities, there were two disciplines, one studying only the form of art and the other studying only the content of art. And these had separate conferences, and the people working in these different disciplines seldom talk to each other. That would be crazy. In the study of the mind, we are still in that stage where these separate disciplines have not yet figured out how to bring these two perspectives together. However, there's a new interdisciplinary field that we call cognitive computational neuroscience, where we try to integrate the sciences of the form and the content of the mind. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nico. That was really great. I'm really excited to get to talk about some of that when we get to our Q&A session at the end. So as a reminder, if you have a question, please use the Q&A button and put it in now, and we'll record them all and try to get to a lot of them at the end after we get to hear from Amanda. So now I'm really excited to introduce our second speaker, Amanda Phingbodhipakkiya, who is a multidisciplinary artist. As an artist in residence with the New York City Commission on Human Rights, Amanda's art series celebrating the resilience of the Asian and Pacific Islanders community, entitled I Still Believe in Our City, reached millions in New York City and worldwide through her Atlantic terminal billboard, subway domination, and social media amplification. In the wake of the Atlanta shootings in March 2021, art from this series appeared on the cover of Time magazine. From large-scale murals, augmented reality experiences, 3D printed sculptures, and interactive installations, Amanda is making the invisible visible. She has explored microscopic universes, familial memories, and the power of collective action, challenging viewers to rethink the world around them and revealing the often unseen depth, resilience, and beauty of marginalized communities. Her work has been shown at the Cooper Union, Times Square, Google, Lincoln Center, and has been recognized by the New York Times, Fast Company, and The Guardian. She has received support from the Sloan Foundation, the Café Rural Cultural Foundation, and the Jerome Foundation. Her work is held in permanent collections at the Goldwell Open Air Museum, the Library of Congress, the Museum of Chinese in America, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Through writing, speaking, and art, she is trying to challenge audiences to rethink the world around them. So please join me in welcoming Amanda tonight.
Thank you so much, Katie. Hi, everyone. As Katie mentioned, I'm an artist based in Brooklyn. I'm also an activist and educator. And today I want to share some of the things I've learned about how art and the brain interact. But let me just step back for a second and talk about belonging, or rather a lack of belonging, and how that shaped my journey. So for a long time, I felt like I had to choose between one of two paths. On one hand, there was the path of creative arts. I spent my childhood as a classically trained ballerina and a competitive pianist, and painting and sketching and drawing have always been an important part of my life. On the other hand, there was the path of science and research. I did oncology research in high school and eventually went on to study Alzheimer's disease and the aging brain at Columbia Medical Center up in Jackson Heights. But no matter how hard I tried to stick to one of the paths, never quite felt right. I kind of felt like a misfit. And I figured maybe that was just my fate, to be one of those people who never feels like they belong. But I was working as a researcher by day and letting my creative side out on personal projects, and very careful to never let the two meet. But that all changed one day when I was walking a patient out of the MRI suite after a battery of neuropsych tests. And, he turned to me and sheepishly asked, so how did I help science? And I said the first thing that came out of my mouth, which was, oh, we can send you our final paper when we're done analyzing the results. And I probably threw in a bunch of other neuro terminology for good measure. And after he left, looking pretty uncomfortable and bewildered, I felt so embarrassed. And somehow, as a reasonably intelligent person, I just hadn't thought that much about how to talk about our work in a way that would make it accessible. I realized that the way I was probably conducting my research wasn't super inclusive or welcoming, and it was probably preventing a lot of folks from supporting our work because they just didn't understand it and felt excluded by it. So I began to see this chance for me to make a new path for myself, one that could intersect the path of science with the path of art and maybe some other paths as well. Now, that leads me to the first work I'd like to share with you. So just bear with me a second while I share my screen. All right. So this is Findings. Findings is a public art series that celebrates women in science. You can find our 7 murals across the United States from Seattle to DC, and each mural is created in collaboration with a badass scientist who works in astronomy or physics. These murals depict science, but also depict how I see women in the world, which is vital and luminous and harnessing our power to fight for our shared futures. So this particular mural is in Washington Park in Denver. So if you're ever out there, please go see it in person. It's called Leading Light. And modern physics has enabled us to turn light into microscopic tweezers, able to basically hold, arrange, and manipulate matter at the atomic level, kind of like a border collie herding goats. So scientists can wrangle these like wild, zoomy, untamed individual atoms into structured 2D and 3D lattices using quantum entanglement. And these lattices open the door for technological breakthroughs that benefit us, like quantum computing. And just like how focusing light into these micro lasers can create powerful tweezers, organized women can also have great power through their unyielding focus. So in Leading Light, we see the science of quantum optics manifested as a group of women focusing their energy to manipulate matter. And this scene embodies the potential of modern physics and the power of perception and perseverance. And whether it's a journalist's careful investigation, a parent's watchful eye, or a woman's pursuit of a perplexing research question or world-changing goal, their focus is their strength. And in this mural, viewers are reminded that attention is love and collective focus is power. This mural was inspired by research done by Dr. Cindy Regal at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Now, this next mural is actually in Albuquerque, and it's called Limitless. And the story behind it is that there's this landscape of bubbles and intrepid women breaking free of these boundaries and reaching out for each other to create change. And this parallels how when orbitals overlap, electrons can kind of leave their restricted bounds and connect and activate and create this sort of state change, like conducting electricity. So when women are isolated and when electrons are isolated, they're kind of inert. But when atoms come together into close proximity and their orbitals are allowed to overlap, there's this flurry of activity in the way that when women commune, they can make magic. So this mural is inspired by the research of Dr. Nadia Mason at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And as a condensed matter experimentalist, she works on the quantum limits of low dimensional systems. Now, this third mural is called Song of Ice and Fjord. I hope some of you get the Game of Thrones reference, but if not, no worries. This mural was shaped by the work of 5 different climate scientists: Dr. Lisa White, Dr. Fiamma Stranio, Dr. Bethany Edwards, Dr. Lee Stearns, and Dr. Wendy Smythe. Their research is seeking to understand the really complex interaction between the ice sheet and the ocean, microbes in the sea, and fire and watersheds. Now, in this piece, we see ice and sea embracing at sunset. And all this new life springs forth and creatures draw near, hoping to decode the secrets of their exchange, which then sweeps across this vast landscape, ranging from coastline to desert. Now, this mural challenges viewers to consider the global reach and impact of climate change. A melting glacier at the poles can cause the submergence of a Pacific island. Warming polar regions can cause devastating droughts, wildfires, and coral bleaching. And we know, as we heat our planet, this tenuous relationship between everything is thrown into disarray. So one of the key principles about these murals is the use of metaphor. Rather than the research of each set of scientists directly, so think textbook illustrations or computer-generated graphics of the inside of a neuron, I'm using analogy and metaphor to illustrate my points. So focused light becomes a group of women looking and gesturing intently at something. A glacier and an ocean become 2 women embracing. And metaphors are a part of daily life, you know, in the things you read, the conversations you have, and more, because of how, you know, kind of muddled and intersecting our brains are. They routinely intermingle the literal with the symbolic. And we know this by how the same area in the brain can be activated by totally different things. The insula found in the cerebral cortex processes both physical disgust and moral disgust. So for instance, I find pea soup gross, and that activates my insula. It kind of makes me want to gag just thinking about it. And it's the same area that actually activates when I would read about something that disgusts me morally, like child predators or human trafficking. So our brains can easily learn to blend the literal and the figurative, and it's part of what makes art so powerful. So when Emily Dickinson writes, "Hope is a thing with feathers," we absolutely know what she means, even though hope is an abstract concept that can't actually be covered with feathers. But by leveraging this odd quirk of our brains, artists like Emily and myself can create connections in your mind that wouldn't otherwise be there. So I just want to share 2 more findings murals just for you to kind of see visually. But if you want to read the stories behind them, you can go to findingsproject.com and read about these metaphors. So the next project I'd like to share with you is called I Still Believe in Our City. Katy mentioned it in her intro. So I created this piece during my time as public artist in residence with the New York City Commission on Human Rights. COVID-19 had swept through our city, and with it, a horrible rise in anti-Asian hate. And that summer, we also had many rallies and protests in recognition of the murder of George Floyd and many Black and brown people who had been wrongfully killed by the police. And so this piece was meant to convey many things: anger at those who would harm innocent people, solidarity among oppressed and marginalized groups, and then hope for those who were losing faith in the city. So scientists have done much exploration around how the brain creates and perpetuates stereotypes. Some early research indicated through fMRI data that activity in the fusiform gyrus, this is a part of the inferior temporal cortex, varied when people were shown pictures of in-group versus out-group members. So what does that mean? So that's to say that there was more activation in the region when people are shown faces of people of their own race versus those of a different race. And that greater activation led to better recognition of those people. Now, most of these studies are done on Black versus white faces. So that kind of leaves Asian Americans who are neither out, but the idea still holds. But more recent research has something really promising to share. By reclassifying individuals with a different set of group membership, they could alter how people responded to someone of a different race, because now that person might be in the in-group for, something unrelated to race. Now, because I Still Believe in Our City focused on this shared identity as New Yorkers, it might have broken through and made viewers recategorize Asian folks not as of a different race, but as residents of the same city as them, New Yorkers who believed in their city as much as they did. All right, so I have one last work to share with you, and it's called May We Know Our Own Strength. This is an installation of mine that was a 6-week-long ritual that held space for survivors and wove their courageous stories into sculptures of hope and belonging. So when people engaged with the art, you could see a mix of emotions from empathy to grief to anger to wonder. And I wanted the piece to show survivors that this one experience that they had, or maybe multiple, was just one facet of their identity, that anyone who has experienced trauma is so much more than a victim or a marginalized individual, and that they will always have an opportunity to write a new story for themselves. So there's been a great deal of interest in recent years around how stories affect our brains. We know that oral traditions date back almost as far as we have historical records. And scientists have found evidence that as someone tells a story and another person listens, their brain waves start to synchronize. According to Yuri Hassan at Princeton, this effect grows stronger the more the listener comprehends what the storyteller is saying, creating this sense of connection. So one study found also that children in hospitals who listened to someone telling them a story had higher levels of oxytocin and lower levels of cortisol. So more warm, fuzzy feelings, less stress. And for the storytellers themselves, they're talking about trauma can be hard. It's a huge part of the healing process. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps Score, talks about how one of his patients realized that he had spent his entire adult life trying to let go of the past, but finally realized that he actually had to get closer to it to move on. Meanwhile, research on narrative identity shows that people who find redemptive meanings in suffering and adversity and who construct life stories that feature themes of, personal agency and exploration tend to enjoy higher levels of mental health, well-being, and maturity. And that's why I created this piece, to allow anyone to anonymously submit their own stories of grief and shame and suffering so they could be safe from identification, yet feel connected to a larger whole. And there's so much more that, art and science that I'd love to share with you, and ideas around how they connect to the brain and scientific research, but it's probably a good place to pause here. So I'll just leave you with a thought. I want to encourage each and every one of you to bring your full selves to your work. You can see how my background in neuro, my desire to communicate and hold space, and my identity as an Asian American, a woman, and an explorer thread through my artistic practice. And it might feel scary to create your own path, but know that it's possible. And you're not alone in wanting to have a life mission that's unique and wanting to leave a legacy that's lasting. Also, there's just an incredible feeling of liberation in charting your own path. So give it a think, and I hypothesize you'll probably find that there are more similarities between all of your disparate interests than you probably realized. Thank you all. And if you want to find me on the interwebs, my last name is very long, so I go by at a long last name.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was awesome. And I'm really excited to talk to you and Nico about everything that you guys have brought up so far. Great, here's Nico, awesome. So what I wanted to start with is to just kind of briefly go back to what Nico was talking about in terms of form and content. We've got a few questions to kind of go over, like what exactly do we mean by that distinction? So maybe Nico can kind of try to give us like a summary, and then Amanda, I'd love to hear like your take on how you see this idea of form and content influencing your work. But yeah, maybe we can, Nico, go back to like, what exactly do we mean by form and content?
You want to go first, Amanda?
No, it's all you. Since you presented on form and content, I feel like you should take this one first.
Yeah, it's a distinction between what philosophers call the vehicle, or computational neuroscientists call the code, so the system of conventions by which the content is communicated.
I loved that particular slide that you had where you described how, there's sort of like an encoding between artist and audience, right? And it's sort of like there's some kind of transmutation that happens between sort of like these ideas that artists and scientists have and how they reach a broader public. And I was thinking about, the different slides that you had about, okay, so this is art, this is not art, this is sort of like closer to art. And, I also feel that art as a practice, as a field, is also so subjective in perhaps a way that science is not. So maybe you could actually elucidate for us, like, what are some sort of like non-art and everyday examples? Like maybe us just like going to the store or something like that, where form and content like sort of come together.
Yeah, so form and content come together in many areas where something is being communicated, and it's, in my view, not always art, right? And it's not art when it's very easy to define exactly what is the form and what is the content, right? And this is why it might still be very interesting. It might still be impressive from an engineering standpoint. Like I really love the not art, right? I love the 7-segment displays. I love the process that goes into optimizing a basis set of little shapes that can, come close to approximating digits, for example, in this case, right? And what happens when you allow more of these segments? How should the shapes change, and how might you engineer something like that, or automatically optimize something like that? These are all fascinating engineering questions, but the thing that you then have at the end is a technology, right? And it's well understood, and it's very clear what the form aspect is and what the content aspect is. So it lacks the kind of mystery that art has, right? And it's not supposed to have mystery, because it's supposed to serve a function. It's supposed to work for technology, or it's supposed to, tell us what time it is when it's an LCD watch. So that's fine, and it's fascinating, but it's not art, right? It's communication without being art.
Right. I think it's so interesting that the line is sort of like so fine, because when we start to kind of veer into, maybe it's a clock, but it says something specific, right? So then it's communicating perhaps an emotion. It's communicating sort of like an intent of the artist to sort of like say something, share something. So I think that's just very interesting. And, scientific research is sometimes sort of like difficult to map to sort of like everyday human experience, because you have to control so much of experiment parameters, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think like communication is kind of a nice example for form and content. Like I can say a number like 9 or 10, and that's like the content, but I could say it in a lot of different languages, and maybe that's like the form. And so the content can stay the same and can take different forms, kind of like with the segmented display. And I mean, I think that's what's super interesting about your work, is like this idea of like, what are you trying to communicate? And like what's, you talked in your mural project about like thinking very, very carefully about how would you communicate these things, and maybe coming up with something that feels a little bit unexpected, maybe to a scientist who would think like a graph, right? Or something like that is like the right way to communicate.
That's part of the fun, right? That's part of the fun. And obviously, a project like Findings won't appeal to every scientist or every researcher, because sometimes it's just a leap too far, which I understand. But I think it does help us sort of, by using metaphor like you do in your work, it helps us connect to perhaps complex and maybe confusing and difficult to understand topics that we can then map to our own human experience much more easily when we hear it in story.
Totally. There's a really interesting question from the audience about the history of art, and how the history of art is often tied to what's going on in like the science world at the time, like pointillism and like this focus on like the study of like the atoms. And what this person is saying, Gordon Silverman, is, so like science today is really abstract. And if we think, Nico, about your work with like computational modeling and these like giant networks with high dimensions and millions of parameters, right? It's pretty hard to maybe think through that visually. So the question is like, can art kind of reflect this when we have such, like when we, even as scientists who are working with it, have like a lot of difficulty understanding the abstractness of science? How does art kind of manage this like abstractness? I think this is a question for both Amanda and Nico, from both sides. Like, Nico, how do you deal with that as a scientist as well?
So how to convey abstract concepts to audiences? So I think a lot about,
even for yourself.
I think a lot about how to visualize things. So visualization is very important to me, and how to lay things out in words and graphics on slides, and sort of the order in which things appear and this work on the visual and verbal representation of what I'm thinking about as a scientist, to me really is part of the scientific work also, because when I'm thinking about how to explain something or how to represent something, I'm really also struggling for my own clarity, right? I start out confused about these things, and the work of defining one's concepts, but also of making images that lay things out clearly, is really the work of thought, or the work of clarifying the content for oneself.
I think it's an interesting question because, you know, science is sort of like on a continuum of discovery, and with art, we're often also communicating the intangible, you know, hope, compassion, pain. Like, you can't feel, I mean, you can't sort of like tangibly touch that, but it is something that we are familiar with and we know. And when we are sort of like hit with it, our response to art, it's sort of like unmistakable. So with regards to sort of like my work in sort of like taking something that's kind of sort of like abstract and also trying to communicate something that is also abstract, what I try to do is sort of center first on an emotion that I want to communicate. Every single work that I create has some sort of grounding emotion or story, whether it's wonder or, you know, it's joy or something else. And from there, you kind of start to spoke out and you start to kind of create different access points. And I think this is what often makes science difficult to communicate to a broad audience, because sometimes when you try to create the many different access points, you start to lose the precision of the explanation. But at the same time, you know, in my work, I am often trying to just spark this curiosity, right? And create this portal to discovery rather than necessarily making sure there's a lesson plan that every single person who sees my work it's definitely going to get every single piece of.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So this is kind of a good segue to what will probably be our final question as we like start to wrap up. And that's, I'd love for you guys to talk a bit about the process for your work. Like, how do you actually go about like achieving what you're trying to do? And how do you think those processes are like similar and dissimilar between the arts and sciences?
I mean, for me, I think they're quite similar. I think we are trying to understand the world and our place in it, and sort of like human nature, oftentimes how we ourselves work. And we are just using sort of like different methodologies and processes. And, you know, with art, you're sort of like trying to tease out a lot of these hidden stories and kind of like reveal them to a broad audience who may not be aware. And it's almost like publishing. It's almost like bringing sort of like this gem of information that you've discovered that is like statistically significant. And now we're gonna, you know, share it with a broader audience. And sort of like there's always sort of like the stress and the worry of sort of like pushing whatever you are trying to create out into the world. But I think, yeah, I mean, they feel just very similar to me.
Yeah, I agree. It's an iterative process, right? Where we have some mystery that we start with, and we have some notion of where we want to go. We want to go in the direction of greater clarity. We want to understand something, lift that mystery, and achieve clarity and beauty in a way. And I would say even in science, there is a sense of beauty. You want to, you know, what you're coming up with, the solution, even if it's a solution to a methodological problem or the solution to a scientific puzzle is often very beautiful, and it's something that we get to in small incremental steps where we know that there's something wrong here, then we change that, and it kind of draws us in, and we don't know where it will take us. It's not a one-step process, and we can't predict where it will take us, but we have this method that we can apply iteratively, which is very fascinating to me, and also I think a key hallmark of how the brain computes. The brain is recurrent, and the brain, applies the same process repeatedly and refines its own representations of the world, even in the visual system, even within just fractions of seconds, to arrive at good inferences, to be able to understand the structure of the scene around us and make good decisions.
I 100% relate to that. The sort of like starting with a study, and with every single study it improves until we're at a space where we can show a broader audience what we have.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful place to leave us. This idea that nothing's kind of one go, right? We're all going at it again and again, and like slowly unveiling, lifting the veil of mystery. That's really beautiful. So we should wrap up. We're a tiny bit over time. Thank you to everyone who came and everyone who submitted questions, which were awesome. And obviously, thank you to Amanda and Nico for sharing your work. Just kind of still in my mind, I have like the pictures from Nico's slides of the neural networks, trying to figure out the difference between the cat and the dog, and then Amanda's like beautiful murals. And I think there's something really magical about kind of seeing how those two worlds are really much closer than maybe people often believe. So we're going to wrap up. Paula is going to let us know about a little survey that we're going to put into the chat, because we'd love to know your feedback and what you thought about today's event. And thank you so much for just spending some time with us today, tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I am just so very grateful to all of our speakers, to Amanda, Nico, and Katy, for just a really wonderful event. It would be fantastic. I mean, thank you all so much for coming and joining us tonight. It would be fantastic if you would fill out our survey and let us know what you thought of this evening's event. I also hope that you enjoyed tonight's presentation enough to join us for the next one. So the next Stavros Niarchos lecture will be on Wednesday, April 27th, 2022. It features our own Zuckerman Institute's own Dr. Ismail Abdus-Sabur, alongside artist, writer, and autism advocate, Kirsten Linsmith. And they'll be discussing the science of gentle touch, the role of touch in our social interactions, and how that might differ in people who experience things like autism. So I hope that you will continue to stay healthy and be well, and I hope to see you soon at another one of our events. Thank you and good night.